Hi biology students, this is Mrs. Miller, and today we're going to be talking about the Ecology unit, Section 1, and Introduction to Ecology. The first thing we want you guys to be able to know and understand is, what is ecology? Well, ecology is the scientific study of interactions among and between organisms and their environment. So here we have a picture of all these organisms within something that we call the biosphere. They're all going to be interacting with each other. So there's going to be different relationships there, and there's also going to be interactions with their environment where they're going to be getting food and getting their needs met. And the study of all of that, that's what we call ecology. So the first thing that we want to talk about, the broadest spectrum of this, is something called the biosphere. Bio means life, sphere means circle, so it's like the circle of life, but not in the same way of Lion King. It just means it's the area or that thin layer covering the entire surface of the earth where all life is going to exist, including land, water, and the atmosphere. So all life within planet Earth is existing within this biosphere. As we continue to go and break down this into smaller and smaller levels, we start with the biosphere, remember that whole circle of life area. Then we're going to break it up into biome, ecosystem, community, population, and then we can finally drill it all the way down to a specific individual. So, as we go from the biosphere to the next smallest level, that's what we call the biome. You guys have probably studied biomes back in like junior high or maybe even middle school, but a biome is a group of ecosystems that share the same climate and dominant communities. So if you looked at a specific biome, let's say like a tundra biome, every tundra that would be on Earth would have very cold temperatures, low precipitation, not a whole bunch of life. So we'll talk about more of those biomes in Section 2. As we go smaller than a biome, we end up in an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is all the biotic and abiotic factors in a particular place. We'll talk about what biotic and abiotic are in just a moment, but bio again means life, so anything that's living. Abiotic is non-living, so all the living and non-living factors that make up an ecosystem. So here with our ecosystem, you can see all the animals, you can see all the plants, those would be biotic, like the water, rocks, soil, stuff like that would be abiotic. As we drill down even further, we're going to look at a community. That would be all the different populations that live in a defined area. So community includes only the living things. So we would see a community being made up of elk, looks like maybe a wolf, owl, moose, bear, and so on and so forth. It would also be all the plants in that area. So we're no longer looking at the non-living pieces. And then we can look at population and specific individuals, but we'll get to that later. What I do want you to know and to understand is the difference between a biotic and an abiotic factor. So a biotic, remember bio means life, so anything that is living in an ecosystem. So plants, animals, bacteria, etc. So here when I look at my picture, I have all sorts of biotic factors, including all of the animals, the plants, the funguses, and then the small things that you guys probably don't think of because we don't see them, the bacteria, the archaea, and the protists. Then we have the abiotic. So A means without, bio means life, so the factors that are non-living. These are all the non-living factors that are inside an ecosystem, so like rocks, water, soil. Here we can see all of them that fall in here, so minerals, humidity, water, salinity, or how much salt, soil, temperature, light. All of those abiotic factors also influence what can or cannot live within a specific ecosystem. So biotic is alive, abiotic is not alive. In this particular video, we're really going to be focusing more on those biotic factors, or the things that are living. And anything that is living has a need, and that biggest need by far is going to be energy. So all living things need energy in order to survive. A lot of times within this presentation, I'm going to abbreviate that as a capital E, simply because I'm lazy and I don't want to type it out. So we need energy for a variety of things. In order to grow, so you guys have grown quite a bit since you were born, that took a lot of energy. In order to reproduce, so plants need and animals need to reproduce, that takes energy to be able to do that. Respiration, movement, all of these factors are needing energy in order for them to work. And as soon as you don't have that energy, that organism is not going to survive. It's that flow of energy through an ecosystem that determines the system's capacity to sustain life. So if you have a large flow of energy through an ecosystem, it can support lots of life, like a tropical rainforest, versus something like an Arctic tundra. Not a ton of energy there, so not a ton of life is going to be there. Without that energy, life does not exist. So that is super important for you guys to know. As soon as energy stops, life stops. And that brings us to our ultimate source of energy, which is going to be sunlight. So we get most of our energy from the sun. That's going to power all of our plants and things like that. And as soon as that sun goes away, we stop having that energy for our plants. So if for whatever reason our sun stopped shining, we'd be in big trouble pretty quick because we wouldn't have that energy. When we think about our biotic factors, specifically we're going to be looking at those organisms that are surviving, so plants and animals. Again, biotic means living. We're going to break biotic factors up into two categories, and that is going to be producers and consumers. It's all about how they're getting their energy. So producers produce their own food. That makes sense, right? So things like plants, algae, bacteria, they're going to be producing their own food, and the way they do that is from the sun. So they can be out in the sunlight, they soak up all that sun's energies, and they make their own food. It's not like you making yourself a sandwich. That's different. So producers use solar energy in that process called photosynthesis. That should be something that you guys are familiar with from our previous units. And photosynthesis is where we're going to convert carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and sugars. It's that sugar that is the food for the plant. So here we can see that picture where we have sunlight coming in, shines on the plant, and the plant is going to create glucose with that. It's also responsible for adding oxygen and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So as a plant goes through photosynthesis, it's cleaning up the air that we breathe, which is really important for us. On the other side of that is we have what we call our consumers. Consumers have to consume or eat their food. Most organisms can't use energy directly from the sun. Like we can't just go outside in the nice warm sun, spread our arms out and be like, sweet, I'm getting my energy. No, it doesn't work that way. We have to eat something. So they get their energy from other organisms, whether it's a plant or an animal. Organisms that rely on other organisms for their energy or food are called consumers. And again, we consume our food. So like right now I could go for a cupcake. I would be consuming a cupcake. This group is going to include animals, funguses, and then some bacteria as well. So when I look at this picture, the grass is going to be a producer because it's going to produce its own food through photosynthesis, versus the vole and the barn owl, which are both consumers because they're going to consume something else. The barn owl is consuming the vole, and the vole is consuming the grass. As we think about different types of consumers, it's interesting because we can break it down based on what they eat. So there are 4 classes of consumers, including herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and decomposers. So herbivores only eat plants. Think about it like herbs, plants, right? So herbivores only eat plants, things like cows, caterpillar, deer. Here we have a zebra, elephant, we have a giraffe, and a rabbit. So they're going to be eating plants. If a person is a vegetarian, they're probably also going to be an herbivore. Next up is the carnivore, where they only eat other animals, or we oftentimes think about this as meat. So that would be like snakes, dogs, owls. Here we have a lion, a tiger, crocodile, and iguana. That iguana is also going to be considered to be a carnivore because it's eating insects, which we don't typically think of as meat, but that counts because it's consuming other animals. Omnivores are where organisms are going to eat plants and other animals. So we fall into that category as humans, or at least most humans do. Crows, bears, pigs, chickens all fall into that category as well. Then the last group is the decomposers. They break down organic matter This would be like bacteria and fungus. So anytime you see like a dead or decaying tree out in the woods, you're probably going to notice that there's probably mushrooms, or it almost looks like there's a mold on it, and that would be the bacteria or the fungus that is trying to break that down, and then it creates more nutrients for the soil. So those are our 4 types of consumers because they're consuming their food. All right, now that you guys understand what types of organisms we have, either our producers or our consumers, we also need to understand how energy flows through an ecosystem. So there is a one-way flow that we're going to see with our ecosystem, with our organisms. So it can only go in one path, in one direction. And the way that it goes is we get our energy that we need for our world from the sun. So the sun is the ultimate source of energy. The producers, like our plants, are going to use the sun's energy to go through photosynthesis, and they're going to create different sugars. Then consumers are going to consume those producers or other consumers, and that's the way that energy flows. It can only go in this direction. Producers can't give energy to the sun. Consumers can't give energy to producers. It always has to go from the sun to the producers, then the consumers. So the relationship between producers and consumers connect organisms into what we call feeding networks. Sometimes we see it like this, where we have our producers getting eaten, and we can kind of see this. But another way that we can show it is, 2 ways actually that we can show it is different feeding networks. And those 2 feeding networks that we're going to see are food chains and food webs. So energy is going to be stored by producers, and it's passed through an ecosystem along what we call a food chain. A food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating or being eaten. So here is a good example of what we see with a food chain. We have our sun that is starting off with the energy. That energy from the sun goes into our producer here, which is grass. That grass then gets consumed by our primary consumer or first consumer, which is a mouse. The mouse then gets consumed by our second consumer, which is the snake. And then that gets consumed by our tertiary or third consumer, which is this bird. So energy can only flow in that direction, from producer to primary consumer, secondary, and tertiary. However, in most ecosystems, feeding relationships are much more complex than a food chain, and that's why we have food webs. So food webs show all the interlocking food chains in an ecosystem, and the cool thing about this is animals can actually appear at multiple levels within that food web. So here we have a food web. On the bottom we have our producers. We'll go right to the mule deer. The mule deer would be our primary consumer because it's going to eat that producer, so similar to what we saw with the mouse. And now maybe it gets eaten by a coyote. So the coyote in this case would be a secondary consumer. We could also see that the plants get eaten by a little pika, so that would be our primary consumer, which gets eaten by a ringtail, which would be our secondary consumer, which gets eaten by a coyote, which would be our tertiary consumer. So it was a secondary consumer with the mule deer path, but it's a tertiary with the pika path. So that's how we can see them with multiple relationships. What we're going to see is when we look at these food chains or the food webs, we're also looking at 2 community interactions, which are competition and predation. Competition is where organisms are going to be using the same or different species that are going to be using the same resource in the same place at the same time. So an example of that could be like lions and hyenas. They generally prey on the same animals, so they're competing for the same herd. It could even be 2 individual lions who are competing for the same food source. So if 2 lions are going after a gazelle, they're competing with one another, just like a pack of hyenas and a pride of lions would also be competing. The other thing that we're going to see here is predation, which is the interaction in which one organism captures and feeds on the other. This is where we have predators, the thing that is doing the killing, and the prey. So here we have a predator-prey scenario where we have our predator on top doing the killing, and the prey is being eaten. The final way that we can show these little community interactions is something called trophic levels. So each step in a food chain or a food web is called a trophic level. The first trophic level is always going to be the producers. So we see those guys on the bottom, and notice that this is the largest part of this triangle because there are going to be a lot of producers in an ecosystem, and they're getting their energy from the sun. Consumers are going to make up the second, third, and fourth, or even higher parts of this trophic levels because they have to consume what's below them, which is the producers. So each consumer depends on the trophic level above it or below it, for energy. So the raccoon relies on the producers, the fox relies maybe on the raccoon, and our coyote maybe relies on our fox. It's easy to view the trophic levels in a food pyramid, and one interesting fact is that only about 10% of the energy from one level gets passed on to the one above. So it takes a lot of energy to feed the bear and the coyote, so that's why there are a lot less of them up here and a lot more on the bottom. If you guys have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, have a great day.